Okay, good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to do just a minute or two of introduction while we give people a chance to connect. My name is Catherine Getchell, and I'm the director of the Office of Disability Resources. Welcome to our PowerPoint or our presentation here. I'm going to go ahead and get my screen share started. Our presentation today, we're going to be talking a little bit about flexibility accommodations, both in light of COVID-19 and just in general. So what we're going to, I put this slide up here because I feel like we've just had to all be extremely flexible for the last couple of months here. How we're going to do this, please feel free to put questions in the chat. Ethan Obstarchuk from our office, who's our program administrator, he's going to be helping me out with kind of monitoring the chat and make sure that I don't miss important questions that come up. Some of them we may not take right away. We may address in later slides. So if you put up a question that I know that we're going to get to in a future slide, then we'll just kind of get to that in that slide. But we'll try to take questions as they come as well, and then catch any at the end. And this is interactive, so we'll have a few different polls that we're going to be giving you guys. But what we're going to do today, the first thing that we're going to do is just give an overall review of the disability accommodations process, just as a quick review on how that works, how we determine accommodations, what happens on the faculty side. And then we're going to take a really deep dive into two of our probably most complex accommodations. These are flexibility with assignment dates and attendance. We're going to really take a deep dive into that. And then we're going to look at how COVID-19 is increasing our need for sometimes these accommodations, other accommodations, even non-disability related adjustments sometimes. And then we'll give you guys some key takeaways and go over some resources. So again, please feel free to use the chat, throw in some questions, and we'll get to those as soon as we can. So just starting with a quick COVID-19 update, Disability Resources is taking point on setting up any temporary COVID-19 related accommodations for students if they are diagnosed with COVID. I'm happy to report that as of right now, we've only had one student who has needed accommodations for COVID, but we know there may be some out there that may not always be connecting with us, or aware that they should reach out to us. So if you're aware of a student who's experiencing some symptoms, whether they have officially been confirmed, tested or not, please send them our way so that we can look and see if there are some temporary accommodations that they might need. Now, if they just need to miss one day of class or something very minor, we may not need to set up accommodations, but if they're going to need a week or two of convalescence, then we'll be in that process. I want to just also say that Carnegie Mellon faculty are, in general, as a rule, extremely flexible and accommodating, and I want to thank you all for that. And the pandemic, as you know, has demanded even yet greater flexibility from all of us. So this is just a really, as everyone likes to say, a really unprecedented time. But let's get into the accommodations process, how Disability Resources goes about what it is that we do. As they say in Office Space, what is it that you say you do here? How is it that we do what we do? So the first thing to keep in mind is that students must be willing to self-identify as having a disability. That word self-identify just means that they have to be willing to say, yes, I have a disability, this is my disability, and I'm requesting accommodation. It doesn't mean that they can only refer themselves. They're certainly welcome to refer themselves, and many students do. But many students are also referred to us by professors, advisors, health services, CAPS, academic support folks, friends, you name it. And one of the really great ways that faculty can connect a student, with the student's permission, of course, if the student's feeling a little bit hesitant about connecting with us, faculty member is definitely welcome and encouraged to send one of us a quick email or send to our access@Andrew email address. We'll put that up later in the slides here. Just a quick introduction email introducing the student to us and letting us know that they're interested in accommodations. You don't have to go into anything about their disability, which means they don't have to share any specifics with you. But if you kind of recommend that they maybe connect with us, even if you're not sure whether they have a disability or not, there's actually a pretty cool video on our website. Steve, who's on the call on the meeting today, was star of a video where he helps a student connect with us and just says, I noticed that you're having these some difficulties with exams. Would you like to connect with disability resources? That's a very, very effective way for students to connect with us. And then we'll reach back out to the student and say, would you like to set up an appointment? Would you like to fill out the application? And at that point, during that appointment or as part of their application is when they can self-identify and say, yes, I have a disability and I'm requesting accommodation. So I have here our application link, the accessiblelearning.com link, where students can absolutely fill out their application. So you're welcome to give them that link as well, in addition to connecting them via email with us or instead of that. So once we have the student connected with our office, the student will meet with either Patrick McHugh, who's our accessibility specialist, or myself. Ethan, can you put the link up in the chat for the Rainier link? Thank you, David. So the student will either meet with Patrick or me, depending on our availability. Patrick tends to work with most of our students because that's his primary responsibility, but I maintain a caseload myself as well. And we will kind of work with the student to identify what challenges and barriers they're experiencing. If they do have a diagnosis, what that diagnosis is, or if they're in the process of getting diagnosed. And we may talk about, are there accommodations that might be appropriate for that student? We don't always set up accommodations for students. Most of the time, though, you guys have pretty good radar in sending us the right folks. So generally speaking, we know that if we're getting connected with a student via a faculty member or a staff member, that there's probably, thank you, Ethan, that there's probably a disability, going on there. Now, if a student does not have documentation right to hand, which many students don't, sometimes they're still in the process of getting connected with a medical professional. They're not really sure how to go about getting diagnosed. Maybe they had an evaluation from 10 years ago that's a little bit old. For all sorts of reasons, we may not have documentation available right away. But disability resources staff are able to evaluate based on the student's situation to determine whether maybe some provisional accommodations would be appropriate for them. Now, we say provisional because if we're going to put accommodations in place without documentation, we're going to do that for a time-limited period. So a good example for right now, let's say a student came to us requesting accommodations, we most likely would give them until August, so until the start of the fall semester to get their documentation in. Now, with COVID and all of the sometimes challenges with connecting up with medical and mental health professionals, there may be some extensions that we need to do this fall if folks are having a hard time getting their documentation in over the summer. But just rest assured that this is a time-limited thing that we do. We're not going to just have a student get accommodations forever without documentation. And when I say time-limited, what happens is that after that due date expires, if the student has not been in contact with us to let us know that they're having some difficulty getting their documentation or they need an extension, the software or the website that we just posted in the chat, actually the Rainier site where they manage their accommodations, their access to that site actually expires. So they're not able to log in and request accommodations if their documentation has not been received and those provisional accommodations have expired. But I wanted to mention the provisional accommodations thing because you may get a question from a student concerned that they don't have documentation right away. That's okay, send them to us anyway. So once we have set up accommodations, whether they be provisional or ongoing, the student's actually going to log into that portal that I mentioned, and they're going to select the classes that they would like to use their accommodations for. And they're only going to be able to pick approved accommodations for those classes. So the accommodations they select will be the accommodations that got approved for them when we set them up. And that auto-generates an email from either me or Patrick to the professor. If there's more than one instructor listed in S3 who's associated with the course, then more than one instructor will get this email. But this is an example. Can everyone see this okay? A little bit dense, but this probably looks familiar to all of you. This is just the summary of accommodations memorandum for our fake student here. And it does not say anything about the disability. It's just going to list what the accommodations are. And the reason that it doesn't list the disability stuff is because we try to protect a student's confidentiality as much as we possibly can. And so we only share disability information on a need-to-know basis. And I'll talk in a later slide about disability disclosure. Okay, so once the student has notified their faculty via our AIM online portal, the next step, and this is where it gets a little tricky, is that they do need to follow up with the faculty member to discuss their accommodations. And this is where you guys are probably thinking, yeah, that doesn't always happen. And you're right, it doesn't. We tell the students that it's their responsibility to connect with the faculty member, because most accommodations do need to have a discussion with the faculty member in order to implement them. There are a few maybe that don't. For example, if a student is permitted to have a snack during class or something like that, that may not require a whole lot of discussion. But anytime a student's getting extra time on exams, they're getting permission to audio record class sessions, flexibility with assignments, attendance, anything like that, there's going to need to be a conversation that takes place in order to implement that accommodation. And like I said, we tell the student that it's their responsibility to connect with you, the faculty member. However, I'm putting in here that students often benefit from the faculty member initiating that conversation, reaching out and saying, hey, would you like to have a conversation about these accommodations, just so that we aren't able to implement them until you and I talk about how we're going to implement them. And that's completely great if you're willing to do that, because sometimes if a student is a little bit new to the process, or maybe part of their disability is an anxiety disorder, or there are some cultural factors that make it difficult for them to feel comfortable talking about their accommodations with the faculty member, sometimes that outreach from you can really help grease the wheels, so to speak. Now, I've gotten emails from faculty saying, I reached out and emailed the student or talked to the student after class and said, can we set up a time to meet to talk about your accommodations? And they never followed up. What should I do? I always say, you've done your absolute due diligence. You've really gone above and beyond. Thank you. And at this point, it really is up to the student to follow up and schedule that meeting. And until that happens, accommodations are not going to be in place. Related to that, I want to talk about retroactive accommodations. We really do not recommend that retroactive accommodations be provided. And that's because at least I'll say in most cases, there are a few cases here and there, and disability resources will be in touch with you if this is going on, where maybe a student was, let's say, hospitalized. And if they're hospitalized or otherwise they're in a medical situation where they really cannot advocate for themselves, they really are not in a position to request accommodations, those are the rare circumstances when we would say, okay, yeah, we might need to look at retroactively, let's say, allowing the student to turn in an assignment late that they missed, or allowing a student to have some flexibility on accommodation or attendance for classes they already missed. But in most cases, no worries. In most cases, we do not recommend retroactive accommodations. And I'll give you an example. Let's say a student has 50% additional time on exams, and they, for whatever reason, don't get their accommodations set up, don't discuss them with you prior to the first midterm. They have the first midterm without accommodations. They come back to you after the first midterm and say, oh yeah, I have that 50% additional time. I want my 50%. I want to retake the exam. No can do. And because we don't really want to cherry pick too much, which some accommodations can be retroactive and some can't. And because we really want the students to understand that it's their responsibility to self-advocate, to be proactive, to get their accommodations set up, that's why we don't recommend retroactive accommodations. That said, if you are aware of a student medical situation that you think may warrant some retroactive accommodations, definitely reach out to us and let us know, because we can work with you and consult with you to kind of help you determine, does that make sense? So you might wonder, well, how is it that we determine what accommodations are appropriate for a given student? I will say, so all of us who work directly with students in terms of setting up accommodations have many both educational and years of experience in terms of working with students with disabilities. We have a pretty deep background in disability, in accommodations, in ADA, so we're able to evaluate those types of requests. But it is an interactive process, and this is a really important term, interactive process, because it gets used a lot of times if a student is filing a complaint with, let's say, the Office of Civil Rights, that maybe their accommodations that were not provided appropriately. One of the things that the Office of Civil Rights always looks into was there an interactive process between the student, between disability resources, sometimes faculty or others when appropriate. And what that means is just that there's this process where the student is sharing what their needs are and options are being discussed, documentation is being reviewed, and accommodations are going to be based on the student's disability needs, as I mentioned, the review of the documentation, and what is reasonable and feasible in a student's given course or academic program. So an accommodation that may be reasonable and feasible in one type of class setting may not be at all reasonable or feasible in another. For example, if a student needs to turn in their term papers, let's say up to 5 days late because of their disability, that may be possible in one class, but it might not be possible in a class where it's homework assignments that are turned in weekly and the professor posts the solutions so that students can study for weekly quizzes. We'll go into that a little bit more, but just suffice it to say that accommodations in terms of their reasonableness do tend to vary sometimes by class or program. And so that's why it's really important to have that ongoing interactive process, that ongoing conversation between the student, disability resources, and the faculty member to kind of look and see what we might be able to do. Faculty should not request medical documentation for anything other than a routine illness. I bring this up because there have been some situations sometimes where, let's say a student is already approved for an accommodation by disability resources. And then the faculty member says, okay, but in order to use this accommodation, I need you to submit to me, faculty member, verification that you have X diagnosis or verification that you had this medical issue come up, and so they're not allowing the student to use their accommodations until that is submitted. That should not happen. And that's because we want to really insulate the student in terms of what they share and the disability information they share. We want to insulate that from you. And that's a good thing for you, because if you are, let's say, grading a student and the grade is not what the student expected, and later on the student says, well, the faculty member discriminated against me because they knew the ins and outs of my disability, boy, then you got a mess on your hands. So we want to insulate you, protect you from that. Now, if the student says, I have the flu, I need to miss class today, and it's something, like I said, a very routine illness, you know, if you have a practice where you're getting some documentation, something like that, I'm okay with that. Just nothing more than, like I said, that type of routine illness. Even something like mono, which is more kind of long-term, I would definitely recommend that person go through disability resources, because we can set up even temporary accommodations for short-term types of things. Now, two students with the same disability may have very different accommodation needs. For example, I'll give ADHD as the case in point here. sometimes ADHD really affects a student's ability to concentrate in the moment. They're very easily distracted, either from things in their environment or just internal kinds of things. And it's really hard for them to stay focused in the moment. So they benefit from, let's say, extra time on exams and a distraction-reduced testing environment, because that will help them refocus, and it'll also give them some extra time if they lose some time from getting distracted. Meanwhile, another student with ADHD may not have as much difficulty focusing in the moment. They may be able to focus pretty well during exams, but they really struggle with time management and prioritization, organization, those kinds of things. And so they may need some different accommodations. They may need some disability-specific academic coaching or some other kinds of tools to help them, but they might not need testing-related accommodations. So I say this just because I want you to know that when we find out what a student's disability is, that does not automatically trigger a set slate of accommodations. It's really individualized based on what each individual student needs and what's going to be most supportive and helpful for them. Like I said, please feel free to post any questions in the chat as they're occurring to you, and we'll try to get to them as they come up or at the end. I wanted to talk about disability disclosure because this one does get a little tricky. A lot of times faculty, because you guys are all so supportive and really wanting to work closely with students and mentor students, sometimes there is this tendency to get into a pretty involved conversation about the student's disability. And sometimes that's get started by the student, because the student may feel that they need to or want to share a whole lot of specific information. They're feeling close to you as a faculty member. They trust you, they feel like they want you to know, or even though we counsel them otherwise, they feel like they have to kind of like go through the whole disability accommodation approval process all over again and tell you about their disability and re-ask for accommodations, even though they've already done that through our office. So we really encourage you to keep conversations with students focused on the accommodations, not on the disability. Because after all, the discussion that you're having is, how are we going to implement the accommodations in my class, not, what's the student's disability? Some faculty have asked me, well, don't I need to know what the disability is in order to decide how best to implement the accommodation? In 99.9% of cases, you do not. The exception may be being, let's say a student has a hearing impairment and is going to be using closed captioning or something, and you might want to have a discussion with the student about what's the most effective communication method for them. But again, you're not getting into the diagnosis. Oh, is it a conduction hearing loss? Is it a sensory neural hearing? You don't need to get into all that, just into the accommodations part. And if you're deciding on how an accommodation can be implemented, that's really going to be based on the structure of your course and the student's particular needs around that. It's not going to be based on the disability specifically. And that's really important, because if, let's say, you have two students who have flexible assignment dates in your class, and you give one student a certain amount of flexibility because of their disability, and then another student a different amount of flexibility because of their different disability, then you're getting into unequal treatment and disability discrimination and all kinds of stuff that you just don't want to go down that road at all. So I would, again, keep it to the accommodations discussion. Now, students may opt to share kind of what we'll call TMI. And if that happens, try to redirect the conversation, focus it back on the accommodations themselves. If you feel that a student really needs some additional support, they're sharing a lot of difficult things with you, please feel free to reconnect them with us. Or if it's more appropriate that they go to CAPS, health services, any type of other support on campus, we're always open to deposit of information. So I've had faculty, and we love this, we have faculty email us and say, just want to let you know, Joe's student shared this serious concern going on, and I just wanted to make sure that everyone's aware of this, and is there anything that I can do? And then we can kind of coordinate from disability resources, from CAPS, from health services, from House Fellow, from wherever it is, to make sure that that student is getting the support that they need and kind of bringing you in on the academic side as we can. So that's some really kind of important stuff about disability disclosure, and that's why we try to limit how much is shared in terms of the disability specifics with the faculty member. So we're going to do a poll where I'm interested to just hear about your kind of practices a little bit with regard to if you're finding that you're having to give folks a lot of extensions on a frequent basis and what that's like for you. And I'm going to ask Ethan to kind of report back on our poll findings. So it looks like we have a good mix. Some folks really don't provide too many extensions, at least on a frequent basis. Some students provide, or some faculty provide accommodations, a lot of extensions, and it doesn't work out too well. We have about 35% of folks saying we frequently provide extensions and it tends to work out okay. And then another 26% of people saying that they do frequently provide extensions for the same student and it works out okay. So it kind of varies in terms of how extensions are working. So I'm going to dive in. That's good data. I want to dive into the flexible assignment completion accommodation. There are a couple of really important pieces of information or things to keep in mind when granting flexible assignment completion dates as an accommodation. And I want to say, we'll talk a little bit later, but we really try to limit the number of students who we give this accommodation to because it does not work out well for all students. But if we are doing flexible assignment dates, it's very, very important that the amount of flexibility be agreed upon in advance for each assignment and that agreement be in writing with specific timelines. I know that sounds like a pain, but trust me, it benefits you and the student because when a verbal agreement happens and then later you and the student have different memories about what was agreed to, there's nothing to refer to. Or if the written agreement is kind of vague, it just says something like, let me know if you need flexibility on a date. That doesn't really tell the student how much flexibility they have. And it can kind of spiral out of control because it can give the student a little more license than perhaps you wanted for them to just drag out an assignment when you really needed to get that project in. You really needed to get that graded. There was a deliverable, before moving on to the next project. And so that's why we say written agreements with specific timelines. And I'll show you an example in the next slide of what that might look like. The other thing that's very important to keep in mind is that flexible assignment dates, that accommodation does not extend beyond the end of the semester. So, translation, flexible assignment completion dates is not an incomplete. An incomplete is not part of this as an accommodation. And that's really important because incompletes are grades, and disability resources is not in the business of issuing academic actions or grades. Now, there are times when a disability most definitely does affect a student's ability to complete the coursework by the end of the semester. But in terms of an accommodation, we're never going to come to the faculty member and say, as an accommodation, we're requiring that you grant an incomplete. What we can do is if you and the student are in conversation about possibly doing an incomplete, and you need to know from us, do we have any information about the student's current situation that would support or not support that decision? Please feel free to reach out to us and let us know what the discussion is and what your questions are. And we can get back to you and say, yes, we do have current documentation that, if you granted the incomplete that would support that decision, or no, we really don't have that documentation. We haven't been in touch with that student since last year. And that can be helpful for you, but we're never going to come out and say, you need to give an incomplete as a disability accommodation. So if you are going to give a student an incomplete, that's fine. Just don't call it a disability accommodation. So when we're talking about flexible assignment dates, that whatever that deadline that you guys come up with, whatever that written agreement, that needs to be by the end of the semester that all of the work needs to be completed as part of that accommodation. I'm surprised I'm not getting more questions in the chat. This is usually where floods of, but what about this? And what about that? So if you're having one of those what about moments, please feel free to throw that in there. Now, flexible assignment dates, it's not feasible for all types of assignments, all types of courses. And I give you some examples here. Posted solutions, this is a big one. If you're a professor who posts solutions because you have weekly quizzes, you have an exam coming up, any type of reason where you really need to get the solutions out there so that students can review the homework and kind of learn from their mistakes and then go on to the next homework. There are a lot of reasons why people need to post solutions, and they need to do that in a certain time frame. So if you're posting solutions right away, it's going to be tough for you to give flexible assignment dates. What some people do is they'll post the solutions, but they'll do it maybe 24 hours after the due date. And what that does is that allows you to give the student, when appropriate, up to 24 additional hours to get the assignment done, which is allows you to give that flexibility without slowing down the progression of the class. So we don't want the flexible assignment accommodation to fundamentally alter how you are designing and running your class. Yes, I saw the chat. So the question was, student has needed to postpone several exams. I know it's going to result in an incomplete. Should I send them to talk to us? Absolutely. Now, not necessarily for your incomplete, but it sounds like in general that student might be having some possibly disability-related issues, and we can kind of evaluate whether that's the case. But with the student's permission, of course, please feel free to connect them to us or encourage them to fill out the application. That's a great question. Another accommodation that, or another scenario where it's difficult, or I'm going to say impossible, to give flexibility on due dates is group projects. So if you had a group of 4 students, and one of them had flexible assignment dates, how do you give the overall group extra time without giving an accommodation to 3 students who don't have that accommodation? So those are types of situations where it's really not feasible to grant flexibility accommodations, and we let the student know that. So when we set this accommodation up, we give them examples like posted solutions, group projects, hard deadlines, other reasons why. Maybe it's a drama production and the production's going to happen on April 1st. Okay, it didn't this year, but normally maybe it would. There's really no flexibility on that. The show must go on. And so there are a lot of examples where this is not possible, but if you're unsure as to, should I grant flexibility? Like we just got a question from a couple professors yesterday about should I give an extension on the term project for this student? We love those questions because we're always happy to help you guys and be part of that interactive process and making sure that the accommodations are provided, but also making sure that the fundamental components of the course are not altered. Now, this is a big one. I'm looking at the chat. Yep, exactly. So if you have a Canvas quiz that is before class and then you're going to discuss the quiz in class, that's a perfect example of you really couldn't give any flexibility on that because part of the class is that discussion of the quiz. And so if a student doesn't post, they don't post, but you can't really, you might possibly, if you think it appropriate, be able to give them an alternative assignment, but you really couldn't give them any flexibility on that particular assignment. Flexible assignments, that does not include exams. And this sometimes gets a little confused and muddled out there. There are a very few students, I can probably guess maybe we have about 10 of the total of about 1,000 students that we serve that do have the accommodation of flexible exam days. And these are students who have disabilities that are such that the disability is going to pretty much incapacitate that student on certain days, and that's going to mean that they're not going to be able to take an exam. it's a pretty high bar medically when it comes to us evaluating whether a student needs flexible exam dates. We really need very specific medical documentation. Good question. So the question in the chat that just came up was, I have lab assignments, lab reports. Would you recommend a specific deadline? Absolutely. Always specific deadlines. In fact, one of the things I have in another slide as a not to do is don't say, oh, turn it in whenever, or, case by case basis, or just let me know if you need flexibility, because that really doesn't give the student any structure on when to turn the assignment in. And that tends to sometimes result in the student just not turning in work. And then because there wasn't a specific new deadline, a new due date that you set up, it's very hard for you to then say, okay, well, you're past the due date, because there really wasn't a due date. And it just gets very, very difficult, really. So any type of assignment, whether it be a lab report, whether it be a term project, a homework, whatever it is, give a deadline. Jumping back to exams, if you have a student who doesn't have the flexible exam date accommodation and is frequently requesting permission to take makeup exams, that's a good student to send our way, as we mentioned before, because there may be something going on. It may be that the student does need flexible exam dates, or it may be that there's some things that the student could do to make sure that they're able to take the exam at the scheduled time. So we will evaluate that, but in general, when you have a student that has flexible assignment dates, assignments and exams are not the same thing. But when in doubt, ask us. Okay, so this is an example of the written agreement that the student and you might follow. Okay, I love this question. Is there a way to give partial credit for late submission of assignments? Yes. I'm gonna say you might want to, if you're gonna do that, that might be something that you want to offer to everyone in the class. But if that's not practical, if you're being flexible and you want to say, okay, here's the thing, we're going to discuss this assignment in class today. So if you submit it after this, I will accept it, but I will only give you 50% credit or whatever it is. We're fine with that as long as that's an agreement that you and the student have reached. If that's feeling a little dicey, if the student's not feeling too sure about that, or you're not feeling too sure about that, that's a good time to just run that by us. But I think in general that could be okay. But I'm also going to just say that it is okay to have some assignments that you can't have flexibility on. It's really okay, we promise. So I appreciate the wanting to be flexible, and that's what I love so much about working with you guys, but it just isn't always possible. But back to this template here, this is an example of the agreement that you and the student might fill out together. Now, as you notice here, it is specific. There are some new deadlines, and then there's some assignments that can't be turned in flexibly, and that's listed here. I'm going to send this PowerPoint out, so if you don't get a chance to look at everything today, don't worry, I will send this out so you can review later. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about this template. It's specific, it needs to be specific, as I mentioned, and it needs to list new deadlines and procedures. The template that we recommend is actually one that the student fills out on their side of our portal in consultation with you. We're working on having that available from the faculty side, but right now it's just filling in from the student side. And then what happens is you get a copy, the student gets a copy, and we get a copy. So the nice thing about it, it not only structures your kind of agreement, gives you some parameters to put in, but it also makes sure that there's a paper trail so everyone gets a copy. Now about this particular agreement, we noticed, go back here, group project was one of the things that was not a possibility in terms of flexibility. Now, one of the things that you might have noticed from that agreement is that it only listed flexibility on homeworks 8 through 10. And you might wonder, well, why not homeworks 1 through 7? Well, because the student either didn't have the accommodations set up until later in the semester, or maybe they did, but they just went to you, on March 15th and said, these are my accommodations. So you don't want to give that retroactive flexibility. So this person just put in homeworks 8 through 10 because those were the only homeworks that were left due in the semester. The previous homeworks, whether the student turned them in or not, would not have flexible dates associated with them. And we will contact you, as I mentioned. In the rare case where we're recommending retroactive flexibility, we'll reach out to you and let you know. So the second poll, we're going to get into flexible attendance. And I want to just kind of get a quick snapshot on how many of you take attendance. And if you do take attendance, what your kind of rationale is for taking the attendance.
All right, well, we have half of the precincts votes in. 72% said that yes, because my course is highly discussion-based or experiential. It's down to 68% now. 26% said yes, because I'm worried that if they don't come, they won't learn. 21% said yes, because students must produce work during class that gets graded. And 16% said no, I don't take attendance.
Awesome. Yes, absolutely. You can check more than one box. I set them up on purpose that way. Thank you so much. So as I kind of guess, most people, at least in this meeting, most people do take attendance. Now, some people take attendance and base it, about a certain amount of percentage of the grade. Some folks have a lower percentage of the grade for attendance, or it's graded in different ways. But I want to talk a little bit about flexible attendance. This is an example of the flexible attendance student-faculty agreement. And again, this is completed on the student side in consultation with you. And this is, again, showing you kind of how you're going to put in some information about what the attendance requirements are. And it's fine to say see syllabus as long as the syllabus specifies what the flexible or what the attendance requirements are for the class. And then to go into a little bit more detail on what, if any, flexibility is available regarding that attendance policy. So you're going to see some themes here. The agreement is specific. It has a certain number of days that are listed and alternative assignments if the student does have to miss class. And this can be really, you can customize this to what your individual class needs are and the structure of your class. We can also help you with this. So if you're not really sure, given the structure of your particular class, how would you grant flexibility in attendance, or how much should you grant? That's a great time to reach out to us and kind of run it by us. But it should not say, just email the professor if you have to miss class, because here's what happens when it says that. The student might email you every class and not come. And that's absolutely not what you intended, because when you set up the agreement with the student, you probably had in mind that maybe they'd have to miss a class or two, and then 10 class sessions later, they've emailed you 8 out of 10 times to say that they can't come. And that's really not what you want. So one of the things that faculty do, especially if they frequently have folks with flexible assignment dates or flexible attendance, as you're kind of designing your course prior to the start of the semester, have in mind what amount of flexibility is going to work for the class and be sort of ready to go with that. Or if a student comes up to you and says, here's my accommodation, I want to discuss this, and if you need some more time to think about amounts of flexibility that you're going to be okay with, that are going to work for your class, that's absolutely fine to say, you know what, I just need to review that. Let's schedule a time for into this week, next week, something like that. You may even say, okay, I can grant you an extra day for this week's assignment, but we're going to need to meet about ongoing assignment flexibility, once I've had a chance to review that. Now, in a remote instruction format, you might for any of these that are remaining, which not too many at this point in the semester, but you might focus those agreements more on participation than attendance, because with everybody in different time zones and different things going on, sometimes people are being really flexible about attendance because they have to be, but looking at how students participate and maybe making the flexibility more around their participation than attendance. And we, as with assignment flexibility, if it's retroactive, if there's retroactive attendance flexibility, we will absolutely be in touch with you to have that conversation and let you know what's going on. Or if you think it might need to be retroactive, please let us know, reach out to us about the student, and we can kind of look into that. So I talked a little bit about this agreement process. The student completes it. Professor, we recommend that you save a copy of this agreement because we can always get you another copy, but because it's not yet available on the faculty side of our portal, the email is probably the best way for you to keep a handy copy of that. But if you need a copy, just shoot Pat or me an email and say, can you send me that? And we're happy to do that. If you choose to do an agreement outside of our template, that's totally fine. We're not the template police. We do ask that it be in writing. So if it's in an email, that's okay. We recommend that you kind of model what you put into that email off of the template. So again, being just as specific as you can about number of days, new deadlines, all that kind of stuff. And I put in here, no verbal agreements, please. Thank you. Got that one. Don't need that one belabored at this point. Now you might want to know which students, who do we grant these accommodations for? Who does this work for and who doesn't it? Well, for a student who is overall able to keep up with the coursework and their disability does affect them, so on certain days they really aren't able to be very productive, but on other days they're able to be super productive and catch right back up, and they have really good time management skills, so they kind of know when, if they have to miss a day of work or a day of class, and they can kind of catch back up, plan that, make their new schedule, set some new priorities. This is the student who this tends to work well for. Now, many of the students who request these accommodations are more the students who kind of fill into this latter category. These are students who it often will hurt more than helps. And so many of the students that we work with who request this accommodation, we don't set it up because either they are struggling overall to complete the coursework. And so flexible assignment dates really isn't going to help them because all that's going to do is snowball and pile up their assignments towards the end of the semester. And they're going to find that while it feels good at first to be able to push back some deadlines, that snow is going to get pushed back till it's a wall of assignments at the end of the semester. And that's why we say really give some, if you're going to set up some deadlines, give new deadlines that still require the student get things turned in so that they don't allow things to pile up. If a student is frequently struggling, I'm looking at this chat. Okay, so good question. So there is a PDF copy of this agreement that's on our website. So if you want to use it and you want to fill it out and have the student sign off, that's completely fine. If you want to create your own agreement of your own invention that's in writing, that's completely fine. Our big thing is as long as it's in writing and everybody has a copy. Good question. So back to, in terms of the students that this does not work well for, if a student is frequently struggling with motivation, either motivation to get to class or motivation to get their assignments done, having flexibility is actually going to derail their motivation. It's going to make them less motivated. Because on that day when maybe they're feeling like they could get a little bit of work done or they could maybe go to class, but they know they have flexible assignment dates or flexible attendance, that's going to cause them not to go to class or not to get the work done because, oh, I'm going to use my flexibility. And then on a day when they're really struggling, they've already kind of used up the amount of flexibility that they had, or they've used up the extra days that they were allowed to miss for class. And now they don't really have any more flexibility. They've kind of run out. So for these types of students, we just don't recommend that accommodation. Same with a student who tends to procrastinate. We don't have any procrastinators, right? All of our students have perfect time management skills. Okay, getting back into reality. So you can see how this really doesn't work for very many students. Now, what we might do is if we're not sure, we don't think that it's a great idea, but the student is really very confident that this is going to work for them, we may set it up as a temporary accommodation and see how it works for one semester only. And then a student will need to come back to us and tell us, hey, this worked really well for me. I want to continue it next semester. And then we'll kind of review, well, how did it work? How did it go with you missing class or not turning in assignment? So we'll use the temporary accommodation as kind of a trial basis. For COVID, there may be some students that do not have a disability that might need some flexibility for non-disability reasons. Maybe a family member is ill. There's different things going on. And so we're definitely encouraging you guys to be as flexible as you can, even if you don't call it a disability accommodation if it's a student that isn't registered with our office. But even some of the students registered with our office might need some temporarily additional flexibility or additional accommodations. We've certainly seen a number of those requests. So stay on the lookout for kind of updates to students' accommodations that you'll get. And we did get a question, well, how do I reach out to a student if I just really haven't heard from them because they're not in class, they're not on campus? I would just say reach out to their academic advisor, their house fellow, their college liaison, anybody that you know that's working with that student. If you've tried to get in touch with them and you have some concerns and you can't, and they've not gotten back to you, they're not in class, you haven't seen them, reach out to all of their supports in student affairs or in my office, whoever's working with them, and we can kind of try to reach out to that student. Okay, let's just really do a very quick poll. We're almost to the end here. Okay, so I just want to get a real quick kind of flavor of whether people are feeling like they have a better grounding or understanding, or if this is just kind of raised more questions.
All right, we have 53% said that they know exactly what they need to do, and 47% still have a few questions but understand the process much better, and nobody has more questions than they did before.
Oh, good. All right. So if you do
question in the chat though.
Yeah. Yep.
My remaining questions would be very specific to my course students, but I know to reach out.
Oh, awesome. Great. Yep. Send us an email. We are more than happy to help and consult. That's part of what we do. Here's some key takeaways as we finish up here. Recommended things: create written agreement, have the student use our agreement templates, although if you want to get creative and use your own, that's great. Be specific and consult with us as you need to. Not recommended are using imprecise language, offering disability accommodations for students without disability, accommodations. Like, don't call it a disability accommodation if it's not verified by our office. So there's a couple things here, but I wanted to mention we are mobile. So if you think, hey, this would be really helpful in my department meeting, or I want to have you do a specific webinar on, flexibility related to art classes or whatever, we are happy to do that either in person once we're all together again or as a webinar. So please feel free to reach out to us. Here's our access@Andrew email address. This is always a good email for just general questions or anything else. Ethan monitors that many, many times a day and forwards those emails out as needed. And here's a couple of additional resources. We do have our portal where you can view a student's accommodations and you can fill out testing agreements and stuff. And then also we have an FAQ for faculty. And again, I'll send out this PowerPoint, so this will have all the links on it. But if you have questions that haven't really been covered, they will be covered most likely in the FAQ. So I want to thank you all so much for attending. We are right at 10 o'clock, so we'll let everybody go, and we'll follow up as needed. Thanks, everybody.